poetry and process. Thank you, Sandy. I guess the recording just started. So let me say welcome to everybody again. Good evening. And thank you for joining us, seekers of wisdom and poetry and process. As you all know, Bethlehem Center is the host of this series. The Interfaith Center of Arkansas, Cobb Institute, and Process and Faith are also co sponsoring this series. Your host and moderators are Dr. J. McDaniels with this beautiful natural background, and Sophia Saeed right here. So today we are talking about L and S. And before we go to our today's spiritual practices, I'll remind you that if you go to the alphabet wheel, or if you go to spirituality and practice website, you will see that for certain letters there are more than one practice. So for example, for L, we already talked about L for love, and today we'll be talking about L for listening. And similarly, for S, we'll be talking about S for silence today, but they also have another practice, S for shadow. I don't think we'll get to that in this session, but maybe one day. We could only do so much in eight weeks. So let's start with S. S for silence, and I'm going to read you at least two or three poems, and then we'll hand it to Dr. McDaniels. So, starting with Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. Let silence be the art you practice. Let silence be the art you practice. The quieter you become, the more you're able to listen. Listen. Listen to the silence speaking to you about the secrets of the universe. You know what, Jay? After reading this poem about silence and about listening, which are our two letters, one almost wants to embrace the spirit of this poem and just be silent. But of course, we don't have all these people here in silence. So let's do a couple of other poems and introduce the letters. So Maulana actually sometimes used the pen name Khamosh, Khamosh. It's a Persian letter translated as the silent one. And this highlights, when he called himself Khamosh, it highlights just how important the practice of silence is to one's spiritual awakening. And Maulana also said in one of his another poems, silence is the language of God. All else is a poor translation. Silence is the language of God, and all else is just a poor translation. How interesting. Even though nearly almost every spiritual teaching rely on the use of human language, none of them are as effective as silence itself. In our Muslim tradition, we have multiple quotes by Jesus Christ on silence, and one of them is that silence is synonymous to wisdom. And there is another quote by Jesus Christ which says, wisdom has 10 parts to it, and 9 of them are found in silence. So, silence is definitely one of the very foundational and prominent spiritual practices in all the world traditions. And one of the reminders I want to give before we go to the next poem, in order to be in silence, one must not only refrain from speaking, but also from thinking. So when I say silence, it does not only mean silence of the mouth, it also means silence of the mind. And honestly, outer silence means very little if there is no deeper inner silence. So let's have another poem by Maulana, which is called actually In Silence. The poem is long, but I think it's very beautiful. The name of the poem is In Silence. And Maulana says, a guide has entered this life in silence. A guide has entered your life in silence. Beloved has entered your life in silence. His message is only heard in silence. So take a sip of this precious wine and lose yourself. Don't insult the greatness of his love, for he helps all those who suffer in silence. Polish the mirror between the breaths. Polish your heart between your breaths and go with him. Go with him beyond words. He knows your deeds. He is the one who moves the wheels of heaven in silence. Every thought is buried in your heart. He will reveal them one by one. Turn each of your thoughts into a bird and let them fly to the outer world. One is an owl, another is a falcon, and one is a crow. Each one is different from the other, but they're all the same in silence. To see the moon that cannot be seen, turn your eyes inward and look at yourself in silence in this world and in the next. Don't talk about this and that. Let Him show you everything shining as one in silence. A guide has entered your heart in silence. His message is only heard in silence. I wish we had time to peel the layers of wisdom from every poem that we have read, but especially this poem. But just to remind a couple of points to you, every time Hafiz or Maulana talk about a special person in their poems and refer to them as a guide or as a beloved or as a friend who speaks to us or helps us, they're generally referring to either God or to a divine source who's always present in our lives, ever ready to help and to listen. So here he's normally talking, here in this poem, talking about God who lives in silence, who speaks in silence, who reveals in silence, who heals in silence. And in order for us to connect, truly connect with that divine force, we need to connect at the deepest levels in silence. And those of you who will be reading Rumi and Hafiz, I hope more. Another point that anytime they talk about polishing the mirror, they're generally referring to human heart, which is the receiver of wisdom and intuition. And polishing the mirror refers to cleaning the heart or cleansing the heart. So, yeah, I think, Jay, with this, let me give it to you. I just love this poem, the way Rumi beautifully says, talks about our thoughts and says that turn your thoughts into the birds and watch them fly away.
Mhm.
Will not be worse in doing so. Rather, you will be liberated. You will be free from all the things that are holding you down. So I think that's very, very beautiful because he's hitting on the point that sometimes our cups are, we're so much full of noise, our cups are so full that we have to empty our cups and hold them up to the beloved so that with humility and in silence, so beloved can fill them. The mind has to be empty in order to receive something. But let's go to process. I think I've said enough, more than enough, actually.
I think that the poems are always more important than the process, but I will still talk about process. Actually, I'll begin with just a word about my own life. I grew up in a Christian setting, a Protestant Christian setting, and whenever anybody talked about prayer in my setting, prayer was always verbal. So prayer was talking to God and then maybe listening for God, but prayer was always verbal. And I had never encountered the idea that prayer could be, that there could be a silent prayer, a prayer that's not talking to God. Really until I think I was a senior in college. And during that period of my life, I became what I can only describe as something of a fundamentalist, uh, a Christian fundamentalist, not a hard-hearted one, but I became too dogmatic, too eager to convince others to believe as I thought right. And I didn't like the person that I was becoming because I'd always associated Christianity with love. But here I was in the name of Christianity, being very unloving. So I went seeking wisdom, in this case from within Christianity, to help me out of my fundamentalism. And I discovered some of the mystical writings, and in particular, I discovered the writings of Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton had a little book, I think it was called Silent Prayer. It may have been called Contemplative Prayer. A very thin book. And when I read that book, I was introduced to the notion of silence as a mode of spirituality. And for some reason, that touched me very deeply because it was an invitation to get out of the words that had become for me sledgehammers. You know, I think I was beating other people with my words. And it was worse than that. I was a philosophy major and an English literature minor. So I still am a person of words. But oh, how I needed the invitation to go to a place beyond words. I really needed that. Now, in my own case, I've mentioned this before. When I went to seminary, I was the English teacher for a Zen Buddhist monk turned master. And I sensed that he was really good at silence. He knew silence better than I knew silence. He could be still. But the stillness was very vibrant. It was very alive. It was very here and now, but it was still. And you could sense that in him, a kind of living stillness. And for him, that quality came through meditation, and more specifically through breathing meditation. So he was very, very adept at sitting in meditation and following his breath, not looking for visions, not praying, just following his breath, kind of like riding the surf, just following the breath. And if ideas came to his mind, he would just go back to the breathing. So the breathing became, in a way, you see, breathing is not verbal. You're breathing right now, and I am too. Your breathing is not a word. It's a process. It's a living reality. And it's with you all the time. So for a time, I began to wonder if maybe Buddhism, at least for me, wouldn't help me better understand the silence of God. Not a dead silence, a living silence. So I've been meditating ever since. I can't say I'm any good at it, but I do know what it involves. So I think I'd like to just note some things about silence as a way of finishing what Sophia says, and then let's just open it up. First, I think we can all distinguish in our minds between external silence and internal silence. And on the one hand, what we really want to talk about is internal silence, a creative quietness of the heart. But I think we should not shortchange the importance of external silence. We live in such a noisy world. There's so much noise, constant stimulation, that I think we all need times when there's less noise on the outside. And those give us little tastes of that inner silence. So I think for myself, and maybe for you too, I think about early morning or late at night. And you may be a morning person or you may be a night person, but is there a time for you that's kind of a special time? And maybe it has to do a little bit with the fact that it's quiet. And you need that quietness. So you get up before everybody else gets up. That's what I do. I'm a 5 o'clock in the morning person. But I know some people for whom that same experience comes at about 11 or 12 at night. It's a time when it's quiet. A time when it's quiet. I used to, and loved it, go to a Wednesday evening prayer service at the local Episcopal church. And we would have a healing service and Eucharist. And I would take my young son, Jason. He was about 8 years old. And we'd go together, and there was his father sitting there in the service. But it was a healing service where you would lay on hands, touch people, lay on hands on people. So it wasn't about words. It was actually about prayer and touch. And I would go up, and people would pray for me, and then I'd pray for them, and we would touch the priest's head and utter a little prayer. But it was the quietness of the touch, in the healing spirit, that was the heart of it. So one night coming back from that, I said to Jason, my son, I said, Jason, I'm so glad you come with me. I'm surprised, but I love it that you do. Why do you like to come here on Wednesday nights? And he said, I don't know, Dad. I think it's because I like the silence. I think it's because I like the silence, because so much in his life was television and friends. He needed a time of silence. Now, what he would do in part of the service would draw. He'd get the bulletin or sheet of paper and he would draw. But you see, that's silence too. That act of drawing, that was silence for him. So we have so many ways to find silence. And then there are landscapes. If you think about landscapes, let me ask you, have you been to a desert? You know, Islam, emerged among a desert people. And if you're at a desert, you look up at the night sky, and it's huge and it's brilliant. And you can't help but feel you're in something wider and deeper, womb-like. That's a kind of silence. I think for some people, water has that calming effect, flowing water. I've known many a mother taking care of children who will say, I need a Sabbath. I need I need some time to myself. I need a Sabbath. And actually the Sabbath can sometimes be taking a shower, being away from everything else and letting that water flow over you. So in the house of silence, there are so many rooms. And I'll mention one more, and then I want to turn it to us. And where do you find silence? I'm struck with the reality of suffering and silence also. And some people undergo experiences that are, or are aware of experiences that are so painful for them. They experience a grief beyond tears, a grief beyond words. I had this experience recently with a good friend who's Jewish. And I had been wanting to talk about the war and to come to grips with him. And I really thought maybe he wanted to talk too, but he couldn't. He said, it's too fundamental. It's too raw. I can't talk about it. And I needed to respect that in him, which I did. But you see, he too was in a place of silence. It's a little different from that peaceful, creative silence, but it's silence. And you're thrown into a world beyond words, where all you have is feeling. In process theology, that's where God meets us. God meets us in the deep place through a kind of inner calling, an inner feeling, a lure toward healing and wholeness within that place. And also as a companion. We're kind of embraced by something that's in process thought, we call it the deep listening. We live and move and have our being inside a deep listening. And it's pure compassion. So that's silence for me. Now, how about for you? Anybody want to share where you taste silence or have touched it in a special way? Let's see, I see Brian with a question. Brian, can you say it? Can you speak the question?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether you're looking at silence in the static view or in terms of wisdom. Wisdom is not static in terms of the answers to the question. Wisdom lies in the questions and in asking better questions.
Well, Brian, you got me. Can you believe having a process theologian who spoke of silence in static terms? So I just want to say, you're right. Whatever silence is, it's dynamic and creative. I just agree with you. And also I agree with you that it can come in questioning. So silence is not the enemy of words and thoughts, but thoughts can take you to a place beyond words. Poetry does that all the time.
I think the silence that comes after the question is golden.
I just want to say amen. I agree. Thank you. Anybody else have a story of silence you'd like to share? Yes, Brenda?
For me, silence is being in nature. I walk a lot in the woods and beside rivers, and to sit in silence in the forest where there is complete silence. And I never find that static. I find that alive. I find that nature around me is giving and inclusive, and I find it's all like wrapping me in love sometimes, and I feel connected, and that's a silence that to me is grounding, and it just keeps me grounded in the rest of my life. So I often go out to find that silence. And you mentioned the silence of grief. I had an English second language student. I helped them out with English. And my last student just returned to the Ukraine. And she was here accompanying part of her family over and seeing them settled, and then returning to her husband and mother. And so the war was looming heavy in her heart. And so part of our English lessons was on Zoom, and then the other part was one-to-one. And for the one-to-one, I often took her out walking in the woods or sitting by the ocean. And we didn't say a word. And because I thought she needs healing, and it's the silence in nature that brings her the healing. And one time we were sitting on a bench in silence, and she just reached over and hugged me and said, "Thank you," because that was the silence that was speaking to her, that she needed so deeply to deal with all the worry she had of what was happening to her family back home. So for me, I guess you might say it's part of the landscape. And it's been like that since I was a child. So it's natural. And it is not static. It is full of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Julie.
Yeah, when I think about silence, I have this little line I really like is the gap between the thoughts. And so I've just done some writing and thinking about that, but that's what I love, is the gap between the thoughts. And sometimes when I'm too busy, I don't have it, but I like it. Yeah.
You know, in music too, there's a gap between the notes. There's silence plays an important role in music too, is the gap between the notes. And in poetry, written poetry, there's the white space. And so the words occur in the context of the white space. And they're the pauses. And that's a kind of silence also. So.
And I studied martial arts many years ago, but that was also too, it was the pause between the moves. Pause between the movements was where there was something happening in silence. Yeah.
And in breathing meditation, there's the gap between inhaling and exhaling.
Oh.
So you inhale, and then there's a little silence, and then you exhale, and then a silence, and then you inhale.
Mm.
And the silence kind of, it's sometimes the most special part, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Brenda, you used the metaphor of being wrapped in silence. Probably not a metaphor, but that's what I was also trying to get at, that in the comfort, there's a sense of being embraced.
Yes, and once I had this beautiful feeling that I was just melting into the silence around me, and I thought, if my life at that point, if I had just melted and just dissolved and connected with all the creation around me, I would have been completely in bliss.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As we leave silence and turn to listening, which is so closely connected, I'm wondering about group silence, when we're silent together with other people. And I've often wondered if, for example, in Islam, when you pray in a group and you move your body, you do the prostrations. I know there's sound around there, but there's a kind of collective presence in something that's not only about words. Sophia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's so. Firstly, collective silence is very powerful. We always host workshops on silence. We used to in person, but we switched to Zoom. Zoom is not the same, but still, sitting in silence collectively is extremely powerful. And what you said about Islam, it reminds me to just add on to what you said before. You used the word a few times, that silence that is not dead, alive silence. And it's just a feeling like that, that when we connect with silence collectively, it's a primordial presence.
Mm-hmm.
Silence is not the absence of noise. Silence is not the absence of words. It's a living, breathing organism. It's silence is primordial presence. It surrounds us. And we need to experience that presence, and it just becomes easier for some people like me, easier to experience when we do it together, when our bodies are moving in yoga like moves and our minds and tongues are silent. The presence of silence becomes very, very beautiful, and it envelops us. I think it's very powerful practice. So thank you for bringing that up.
And Alice just mentioned the Quakers. They're so rich in the experience of silence as a way of being.
I had that experience a number of years ago. Meditation has always been a part of my adult life, I would say, in the last 20 years. But in the process of working on diaconal ministry, we had an opportunity to visit a Quaker service. I was profoundly moved by the experience of a full hour in silence in a circle together. And then amazed at the afterwards, the chatter was not a conversation about how you were, but in how they then moved into service in the world, in the projects they were doing. it was just a really beautiful experience. I sometimes wondered why I haven't more seriously sought out a Quaker experience since.
Well, let's continue to talk about silence while I introduce listening as well. I'll remind you all of I don't think it's a quote, but Father Richard Rohr talks about group silence, and when we are together and we sit in silence, he says that silence actually protects the autonomy and dignity of events and persons and people. And how does it do so? Silence actually surrounds every I know with a humble and patient I don't know. And I always find it so beautiful. I would rather sit with that I don't know instead of saying I know. When I was looking for poems yesterday, it was very hard to find separate poems on silence and listening, because any poem I found from our Sufis, Maulana and Hafiz, they touched on both the themes equally. So let's introduce listening with a verse from Maulana in which Maulana says, listen to the presence in the poems. Listen to the presences in the poems and let them take you where they will. Follow those private hints and never leave the premises. It tells you how deeply and intrinsically related silence and listening are. You cannot do one without the other. Listening is a very essential part of discernment process. And that's why Sufis and mystics and poets talk about it a lot, because it helps us identify the messages of God. And often you will see these mystics talk about a very, what should I call, the active, deep kind of listening. I hope Jay will talk more about it. But deep listening takes time, it takes skill, and it takes a readiness to slow down and let go of all the expectations that you have, let go of all the judgments that you have, let go of boredom, let go of your self assertiveness, your defensiveness, and just experience listening to others while forgetting everything else around us. So, listening, because it helps us discern, listening to the divine voices, but also listening to each other while practicing deep listening. Last week, we talked about hospitality. And I bring it up because hospitable people are always good listeners. In fact, listening becomes a form of spiritual hospitality because it helps us invite strangers into our lives when we listen to them. I think it's one of the most powerful and precious gift that we can give to somebody by listening to them quietly, with fascination, with attention, with our whole being, while being fully present. It just takes down all the walls of separation from between two people. And that's what deep listening is like. Hafiz Shirazi once said, how do I listen to others? How do I listen to others? As if everyone were my master. How do I listen to others? As if everyone was my master speaking to me his cherished last words. And how do I listen to you? As if you were the alpha and the omega of all sounds. That's deep listening from Hafiz. It improvises our own receptivity, and it sharpens our ability to hear around us. It intunes us to others, and it also intunes us to our own voices, our own intuition. So silence and listening. So before I give you this poem, remember, whenever I'm speaking too much, I remind myself of this wisdom by Native American seers who said, speak only half as much as you listen, because God gave you one tongue while 2 ears. So a poem by Rumi, and then I pass it on to our teacher, Dr. McDaniel. So this poem is called, What is Deep Listening? So Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi asks us, what is deep listening? Sama is a greeting from the heart. Sama is a greeting from inside the soul. The branches of your intelligence grow new leaves in the wind of this listening. Actually, let me pause for a second. So many of you might not know what Sama is. Sama is actually a means of meditating on God through focusing on either music or melodies or instrument or dancing. So Sufis or mystics, they practice meditation through sama, which is a very popular spiritual practice in Islam, while focusing on music or whirling or dance or walking. And it's supposed to bring out God's love and purifies our soul. But there is a whole body involved in this meditation practice. So going back to Maulana, he says, what is deep listening? Sama, which is a greeting from the soul, from inside your heart, just like a letter. The branches of your intelligence grow new leaves in the wind of this deep listening. The body reaches a peace. Rooster sounds come, reminding you of your love for dawn. The reed flute and the singer's lips. The knack of how spirit breathes into us become as simple and ordinary as eating and drinking. The dead rises with the pleasure of this listening. If you cannot hear a flute melody, sprinkle dirt on your head because you're dead. Listen and feel the beauty of your separation, the unsayable separation. There is a moon inside every human being. Learn to be companions with it. Give more of your life to this listening, to deep listening. As brightness is to time, so you are to one who talks to you, the one who whispers in your deep ear, the one who talks to your soul. I should sell my tongue and buy 1,000 years when that one steps near and begins to speak. What is deep listening? Back to you, Jay.
In the early days of the feminist movement, when women were getting together as women to share stories. There was a theologian, her name was Nell Morgan, and she was at one of these early gatherings, and they would sit in a circle and just go around sharing their experience. And she describes one woman in the circle who was very shy, very hesitant, maybe distrustful, and didn't want to do that. But it got to be her turn. And the woman said, you know, sometimes I feel just like a zero, like a doormat, like I'm just a utensil for my family, for my husband. And as she was talking, all of a sudden, she stopped talking for a bit. And she looked at everybody in the circle and she said, "You are hearing me. You are hearing me into speech." And they were. Because in their listening, in their focus on her, she was being empowered to speak in ways that she had never been able to speak before. They were hearing her into speech. And I think that phrase captures something very important in life, that we find ourselves when we feel listened to. And listening is a deeply empowering form of love. And sometimes it seems to me we forget that. We forget the listening side of love. We think of love as doing things for people or making things happen. And that's part of love. But love is also listening. And Sophia's exactly right, and Rumi's right. We need to listen with the ears of the heart, not just with the mind. We need to listen with the ears of the heart. And what in Rumi's image of the moon inside people, I like that. We need to listen for the moon inside their hearts. Listen for the quietness. Listen for the beauty. And that's not just listening to the suffering, although that's part of it, to be sure. It's listening to the stories. It's listening to the joys. It's listening to the doubts. And that's just such a profound form of love. And so in process thought, God is the deep listening. It's like we're swimming in an ocean. And God is the ocean, and that ocean is the deep listening. So when we listen to others in generous ways, we participate in God. We participate in God. Also, I think it's maybe important I have seen people that can listen with their eyes. And I have seen people that can listen with touch. I think of nurses in hospitals with a spirit of gentle touch. So I think listening can involve many ways of being. It's not just with the ears. It's not even just with the heart. it's with the eyes, but it certainly involves patience, a slowing down, like Sophia was saying. Sometimes I think of God as the deep slowness. I know God is vibrant and dynamic, but oh, the richness of the slow. So that's kind of what I have to say. Does anybody want to share your own insights about listening? And we could also talk about discernment too, if someone's interested in that. How do we discern the guidance, the will of the Spirit in our lives? How does that happen? But how about you? What do you think about listening? Who would like to share a story or a thought? Alita, is your hand up? No, sorry.
Of course, I have a story. When I was early teens, like 14, 15, I spent a lot of time with a group of people, and we would meet in the summer to discuss nonviolence as it related to our individual personal lives, to raise your children, where you work, all of that. And one of the exercises that we did was a day of silence. We went about our regular activities, going to the store, going to the farmer's market, preparing dinner, all of that, but it was in silence. And it was very interesting to communicate to people and see their reactions when you didn't verbally respond. And then in the evening, when we had our meetings, we would all sit in silence for a couple of hours. So there were little kids running around. It was a totally different kind of way to be. Like the atmosphere around us was different. And I've always felt that listening, true listening that you were talking about, that is the most active form of love.
Yeah.
The most active form of love is to truly listen to somebody. It's not passive.
I agree with you, Deb. I think most people here do.
Mm-hmm. We just often don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
One of my pet peeves is in services or situations where they'll say, now let's have a moment of silence. And then somebody breaks in with some music or something like that. That's not silence.
Yeah. Well, you know, in my worship services, I say, let's have a moment of silence, and it lasts for about 4 seconds.
Right.
and then you move into something else. And I took a Buddhist friend once, and he said, oh, I thought it was going to last for 3 days. So anyway, thank you so much. There was was there a question in chat? Did I miss? Oh, yeah. It's about listening to people that are hard to listen to. Is that the question, Julie?
Yes.
Can you say something more about, just a little more about that, please?
Oh, I'm not sure what to say. Yeah, from their point of view, the conversation's never over or satisfying.
Oh, yeah. I think you have to listen, in my view, without attachment to consequences. You know, the outcome, who doesn't love a favorable outcome? There's an understanding or a peace of mind or something like that. But I think that in the last analysis, you listen because it's an act of love, without the expectation of agreement or anything like that. It's an act of generosity, but not in a paternalistic sense, not like, here I am, the great listener, and not in that sense. It's a humble, there's a humility in it also.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very hard to listen to people that we disagree with, that we strongly disagree with, and especially to the point of views that we don't agree with. So I just think it's very important to keep in mind that listening to those people that we disagree with does not grant them legitimization. It just grants them humanity. And nowadays we live in this world when it's very hard to listen to the other side. And I am guilty of that. Sometimes I just don't want to listen to the other side. And then I keep on reminding myself that, Sophia, listening does not grant the other side legitimacy. It just gives them humanity. And it also preserves our own humanity. So that's something to keep in mind too.
So, Sophia, do you think that we also need to listen to ourselves and kind of make contact with ourselves? Do you think some people, they listen so much to others that they don't listen to their own hearts? Do you ever see anything like that?
Absolutely. And that's where the silence comes in. I think that's why silence as a spiritual practice is extremely important, because it helps us get in tune with our own inner voice. And nowadays, the noisy world that we live in, it's very easy to get our own authentic voice drowned in all the noises that outside. And I loved what Debbie said, the day of silence. I think we need days of silence in our spiritual practice so we can listen to our own selves. Actually, I was going to read a poem today, which I didn't, and it's called A Day of Silence, actually, by Hafiz. So can I respond to Debbie really quickly?
Yeah, of course.
So, Debbie, there is a poem by our teacher, Hafiz, which is called A Day of Silence. And he says, a day of silence can be a pilgrimage in itself. A day of silence can help you listen. Listen to the soul playing its marvelous flute and drums. Because talking is just the crazy defense of a crumbling fort. Didn't we come to this world just to surrender in silence? To yield to light and happiness? To dance within in celebration of love's victory? Sorry I did it rush, but I thought I'll...
That's beautiful.
Called A Day of Silence by Hafiz.
Sophia, what was that line again about the defense, the fort? What's that line again?
I mean, I changed it, but isn't talking about... Isn't talking become the crazy defense of a crumbling fort?
Wow. Yeah.
So talking is like crazy defense of a crumbling fort, and we really need to hear to our own self that we don't do so. A day of silence could be a very good reminder and a practice for all of us. Actually, in my spiritual practice, I'm a Sufi, and when I initiated on this spiritual path, among many different practices that were given to me, one of them was keeping a fast from speaking once a day. No, sorry, one day every week. So which I'm not saying I do that, but I'm supposed so every week I have to pick one day, and from dawn till sunset, I shouldn't be speaking and keeping a fast of silence or a day of silence, just to help me get in tune with myself.
I think it's important to remember that just because someone wants to speak does not mean that we have to listen to them. If we're not in a good place or it's not the right time or I can say to someone, I'm not really in a good place right now. Let's talk about this another time. Did you hear me?
Yes, I
Okay.
did.
Okay.
That is a very good seg. Let's see if Jay has to comment. Otherwise, it's a very good connection to our closing poem. Jay, would you like to say something?
No, that's Deb. I just wish you'd told me that about 20 years ago. Okay. Go ahead, Sophia.
Okay, so let's close our session today with Maulana again. But reminder to you all that firstly, gratitude for joining us, our sacred space, and bringing your collective wisdom. And next week is our last session, so I hope we'll see most of you. Let's close with Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi with a poem called Be Silent. So Maulana says, be silent. Only the hand of God can remove the burdens of your heart. Be silent. Be silent. Because the one who has seen the beloved's ocean cannot be roaming around a small stream. Be silent. Be silent, since the silent one will make everyone taste this wine. I took a vow of silence, and now my tongue is tied. Yet still, I am the speaker without a speech tonight. Be silent. There's nothing more to say after that. Peace, salam, and shalom to all of you.